Hi, and welcome to Alive with Chronic Illness, a podcast dedicated to exploring what it's like to live with and not in spite of chronic illness. Today I'm joined by Grace Quantock, an anti-oppressive psychotherapeutic counsellor, advocate and author, who is here today to chat about her new book, Living Well with Chronic Illness, Write Your Own Roadmap to Healing in Tough Times. Thank you for joining me today, Grace. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. So, as you say, my job is I work as a therapist and also as a writer. So I've just written this book, which is just coming out. And I am based in the valleys of South Wales. I live here with my 3 rescue dogs and my partner. I'm disabled. I'm a wheelchair user. I'm neurodivergent. I've lived with chronic illness since I was 13, and I was born with physical difference. I've lived with physical difference, obviously, all my life. And I'm really excited to be talking to you because I'm really excited about the podcast and the conversations that you're creating and curating. So thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with you.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed reading your book. And the first thing that really stood out to me about your book was how inclusive it feels. Your thoughtful acknowledgement of those chronically ill people who are no longer with us. It felt like it was really capturing a feeling of community that transcends time, that what you were writing was actually still putting a nod to the past and experiences of people who have been with us. And I felt like that really showed a sense of awareness of the impact of your work. And that self-awareness is throughout the whole thing. You're very open that this is not, you're not always going to get it right. And it's very much take what you will from this and adapt it to yourself. And I'm interested to know whether you feel like your journey of chronic illness made you feel more self-aware.
It's a great question. So, just speaking, if it's okay, to your first point about, the dedication and the thought about community. So I'm so glad that comes across because it's such an important part of the book and of my work. And I will say, actually, I think that has probably contributed to my self-awareness, so much because we often, I think, are fed narratives about illness which posit a singular sick person surrounded by healthy and non-disabled people who are kind of working to get the brave sufferer back on their feet. And like probably many of us throughout COVID, I've had people say to non-disabled people say to me, like, we can't adapt something or bring it outside or deliver it, whatever it is. Don't you have a non-disabled friend or family member who can do that for you? I'm thinking, so firstly, you're asking me to risk somebody else, which is a self-problem. But also there's this picture of isolation. And a lot of disabled people are, of course, we are very isolated. But it posits this idea that there is a larger healthy group and that we are somehow about to rejoin them. And that's just not been my experience. My experience is that I'm among people, I live in social housing. So I live, with alongside people. I'm one of 2 wheelchair users in my street. I'm surrounded by other disabled and chronically ill people, as are many of us. The Office of National Statistics points out that I think 49% of people are living with long-term illness in the UK at the moment. We're talking about large numbers, but we often don't hear about it like that. And so I think there's this idea of independence, that we're kind of helped charitably, but we're supposed to pull up our bootstraps and be independent, get back on our feet. And I really want to posit the idea of interdependence, of us being part of communities and communities of care and family and navigating the world. And I consider myself to be part of, the kind of disabled ancestors, activists, advocates who inform and have informed and still inform my work, some who I cite and reference, of course, some who have just, informed my personal journey. And thinking about, the legacy of this work is hugely important to me. It's part of a much wider community-based way of working and thinking. And about the self-awareness, I do feel that the journey has made me more self-aware. And obviously I'm a therapist. I've been in therapy for many years myself. But I can't speak more to that. But I just wanted to start by saying thank you for picking up on the community. The interconnectedness is a hugely important part of why I actually wrote this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really shows in the work that you've done, and you can see how much thought that you've put into every page.
Thank you. And in terms of that self-awareness, I thought thinking about this and thinking, I know you didn't ask this, but I think sometimes people sometimes people will kind of want to bring what they consider a positive out of a form of suffering. So say, well, I've had quite a lot of, well, at least you got a book out of it. And I'm like, right, well, think of the books that I could have written if I hadn't been dealing with ableism and a lack of a coherent pain management plan or et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think chronic illness itself necessarily engenders self-awareness for people. It's something that I particularly am interested in because, like I say, I'm a therapist. But chronic illness can require us to be self-aware, to be aware of our bodies and our symptoms and manage them or navigate them. But then we also have the trauma, potentially, of chronic pain, of ableism, of perhaps medical racism and misgendering, of anti-fat bias, all of these things. And they can cause us to not to want to be present or to not to be able to stand to be present, to check out, because we can't stand to be in contact with ourselves. Because if our body is the site of the trauma, the site of repeated pain and suffering and traumas, we perhaps can't stand to be there. So then we have the tension of the requirement to be present because we have to check, is that funny sensation going to be a UTI? And what happens if we don't notice that UTI? And what if somebody else dismisses us or doesn't want to give us a dip test or whatever, And so we perhaps need to monitor symptoms, especially when they might be dismissed. But we also have that pull then to check out and not be too granularly, minute by minute, in touch with the sensations of pain or sickness or whatever symptoms we're dealing with. So in the book, we do talk about like that navigation of finding a level of body, of self-awareness, of embodiment that works for us and that we can engage in safely and sustainably. Because again, I think mindfulness is often misused and people will say kind of like, be mindful, kind of do meditation. Well, that's great if it works for you. That's great if it works for you. But what if when you're meditating, you come really closely into contact with your intrusive thoughts? Or what if you come really closely into contact with the pain that you've been kind of just trying not to look at too much so you can get through your day? And it's not to say you don't meditate. It's to say if it works for you, we find a way and it's not for everybody, but it's thinking about finding what we can engage in safely and sustainably.
Yes, absolutely. I think for myself, I do mindfulness meditation, but it's absolutely not something I do during a flare up because I don't feel in that point that I want to be focusing necessarily on the present, if I'm completely honest. I don't want to be thinking about how I feel. I want to be doing something that's like a positive distraction. So yeah, you've touched on some really brilliant points there. So throughout your book, there's a number of journaling exercises. What was the process like when you created the exercises? Did you always know that you wanted to add that interactive element?
So all the exercises are directly from either the exercises I do one-on-one with my therapeutic clients, so they're exercises I developed in working with clients, or from journaling workshops that I've taught when I've taught live workshops. So many of these exercises, I should say all of them really, I've been teaching for over a decade. So they've been, some of them, I didn't develop them as an exercise. Perhaps I was working with one individual client and something came up in that work and I kind of said in the moment with that person, well, shall we look at this? And I kind of made it up on the spot based on my knowledge of that client and what might be necessary in that work. And then perhaps it was useful and perhaps I thought, oh, actually, there's something here. This is like a little exercise that we've kind of co-created in the therapeutic space. So I might say, if I were to make this into an exercise, would that be, because obviously it doesn't contain any client detail or anything. So, would you be comfortable if I kind of develop this as an exercise and kind of use it more widely? So people say, yes, like I really want you to use that with other people. I want you to kind of gift that or bring that further. And so in terms of, did I want the book to be interactive? In the beginning, it had exercises and it had journaling, but they weren't necessarily together. And then my wonderful editor, Jessica Duffy at Orion Spring, had the idea to kind of frame the whole book as a process through which you write your own roadmap via the journal. So originally the roadmap was kind of the one chapter. And then I went back to exercises that perhaps were less journaling based, or perhaps were more, you might do a visualization. So now we'll say like perhaps you do the visualization or you write it and then you kind of bring it back to the journal. So the journal is kind of the anchor. But I always wanted it to be interactive and pragmatic because it was never intended as a lecture or a thought exercise or even as my experience. There are prompts for scripts, for packing lists, for prepping for flare days. And I'm always really interested as a therapist and in my kind of advocacy work in the moments when you actually go from the theory into the change, when that kind of concept meets your daily life and that actually makes a difference on the ground in our lives day to day.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think having those opportunities to engage with, like you said, the roadmap of it, I think that's was probably one of my favorite things about it, and the way it's set out so that you're going on that journey as you work through the book. And I think as well, so if you get like a new diagnosis, you can just go back through different chapters and you can revisit those exercises as well. Do you have a favorite exercise from the book?
I wait so many when you ask this. Oh my goodness! And you're absolutely right. Like what you're describing, to go back when you get a new diagnosis. The content of the book is what I've used with my clients and myself for decades, and so that's exactly what we do. What you're describing is I'm really glad it's coming across that that's exactly the process. So I thought about this. I love the mapping our ground. I love whose voices. I love Healing Passport. Love Healing Passport. I think I've seen it work with so many people. I've seen it, make huge differences in people's lives. I really like the Heart of the Dream exercise, but I think probably right now it has to be the plates exercise, which is the last exercise in the book, because I'm doing the plates exercise a lot as I do promotion. And actually, that exercise came first came from my own experience, and then I started using the concept with clients. So it's where we look at different kind of concept plates and what we're holding in our lives. And when I actually first thought about the idea, the concept of like I had to kind of hold plates of symptoms or of kind of whatever I'm doing, like talking to you today. I was in a flare and I was staying at my grandmother's house and I was very, very sick. And my brother was in the room with me and he was humming and he was going, and he just wouldn't stop. And I was like, my love, could you please not make that noise? That's a really, really difficult noise for me. And, and he kind of, I think he was just unconsciously doing it. And eventually I kind of snapped a little bit and went, oh, could you please stop doing that? It's actually hurting my head. And I heard him trot into the kitchen, talk to my grandma, my aunt, to go, Gracie just snapped at me. And because I was only going hum, 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 my grandmother went, well, that's a very annoying sound. Perhaps you shouldn't be humming. But then I realized, I thought, well, why was I snappy? What happened there? I realized that I had kind of so many symptoms on my kind of my one plate. My emotional regulation was not very engaged at that point. I had very little space in my kind of window of tolerance, and so I kind of was sharp much more quickly. And that's why I started thinking about, well, how do I know how much space and capacity I have, and how can I navigate that? And so that's where the plates exercise came from.
Yeah, and I think for myself, I try and get to a place of understanding my own capacity, and I don't think I'll ever truly master it. But it is that awareness of just that this is my energy, and with maybe I'm feeling low energy one day, different things might affect me in different ways.
Yeah. And here's the thing, for many of us, if it was all external factors, then we would just do everything we could to figure out what the ideal external factors are, and then put all our energy into maintaining a homeostasis in our environment. I can't say we can necessarily do that, and of course there's various privileges involved in how much we could do that. But then of course if it was all internal and our external made no difference whatsoever, then we could do what we like with our external environment and just not worry about pacing or having to eat in a way or food allergens, because none of that existed and it was all just our body's doing what it's doing and nothing we do impacts it. Then we could do what we like and not worry about it. But of course what it is a combination of some that's internal and some that's external, and we don't necessarily know which is which, and we don't necessarily know what's going to happen at different times. So it's that uncertainty that kind of keeps us guessing and makes the difficulty.
So on the topic of balancing, I was really interested to understand your process of actually creating this book. And I think you mentioned there that initially, like 15 years ago, it was a bit different. So it's obviously been a very long process. Was that partly to do with, I suppose there's a lot of factors that came into that, but I'm interested in the element of how did you balance your energy while still trying to be creative and make this work?
Yes, I mean, it has been a long process. I started writing this in 2010. So yeah, it's been a long time. I wasn't writing the book the whole time. Like I did drafts and then I kind of, tried to get an agent and things like that. But it's been iterations of it since that time. And when I actually first started writing, I was had to, dictate a lot of it because I was, unable to kind of move my arms out of being in a car accident and things. And so I had a lot of kind of pain. Actually, the car accident maybe later. But anyway, I had a lot of pain and weakness. But sorry, I'm remembering different dates. But yeah, in terms of like the balancing the creativity and the research and the energy levels. So I do a lot of batching of work. So I kind of tend to segment up days and I batch things. I also do a lot of planning, which you can tell from the book, which has got doing the healing passport in it and doing all of these things that kind of involve plans. So we talk a little bit in the book about setting up systems. And I love what my teacher, Kelly Deals, says. She talks about building little engines so that you don't have to become a machine yourself. And I was like, okay, I like this idea. So I have a lot of systems and routines in place that hold things so that I don't have to. So for example, like I just today renewed a medication, which is on a 12-month prescription. So it's great to be able to have a 12-month prescription. So I haven't got to have reviews like every month to re-get that medication when I know I'm going to be on it for a long time. So it took work to kind of manage to get a 12-month prescription set up and figure all that out. But now I only had to do that once a year. And so, things like, and we talk about this in the book, so things like, working out what is a thing that I can systematize. Once we have that set up, it does save a lot of energy and capacity that then I could use to make the book.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant tip. Just if you can put things in place so that they're almost easier to sustain. They might be a little bit harder to get to that point, but once they're in place, it just helps keep things going a bit more smoothly and helps you balance that energy and capacity. So I think we already touched on this a little bit, but why was it important for you to create this resource?
So I increasingly, over the years, I've been more and more disillusioned and disappointed by and fed up by a lot of more mainstream wellness self-help, which I experience as often very prescriptive, very aspirational, very focused on aesthetics, very focused on whiteness, thinness, het cis presentation, middle class presentation, hearing, certain presentations of femininity, all of these different things. And I saw that it was ignoring my lived experience, the lived experience of my clients, and I saw it doing damage. So I work with complexity in bodies and in trauma and in people's lives overall. And so I wanted to offer an alternative to this one-size-fits-all self-help that doesn't acknowledge people with chronic illness, with disability, with bodies that are deemed non-normative. And I wanted to provide an alternative to what I've termed the bootstrap wellness narrative. So, these ideas that we can pull ourselves up by bootstraps, that as we were saying in the beginning, that healing is individualistic, it needs to be perfectionist, and it tells us that we can and we should heal alone, and if we try hard enough, try really hard, we can have a quote unquote normal life. But that assumes that we all have access to the same resources like wealth or fresh food or transport or safe housing or green space or medical care and so much more. And it ignores systemic inequities and often draws on makeover stories when the suffering is long past. There was once a problem many, many, many years ago, but now they're better. Now it's all okay. And I don't want to assume access to those kind of resources or even those kind of normative ambitions. People may not want to live in these ways that we're told we're supposed to be, and that's okay. I think it when it ignores systemic inequities, it's telling you you can do it all yourself. But I think this is actually really disempowering. It actually makes us more powerless because it's saying, you don't worry about the face. Get outside and exercise. It'll be good for you. Right, okay. But, I don't have a ramp in my council flat because they wouldn't fit one, because they said to fit one, they'd have to make it big enough for like a power chair and a turning circle. I'd have to remove my garden in the front, and they're committed to preserving their green spaces, so they won't remove the garden, even though I don't think it needs to remove the garden in the first place. So I can't get out of the house on my own. And then if I do, there's like potholes and like I can fall into the road and like, or experience harassment, as many disabled people do when we're in public. So I can't overcome all of that by like thinking positive and trying hard. And if you tell me I can, and I try and fail, then I feel ridiculous and useless and like I failed in something. Whereas what if I haven't failed? What if I have been failed by these narratives that tell us this? And what if instead we can discern and say, okay, well, for example, maybe I couldn't get the ramp. Maybe I can try again and do an appeal, or maybe I can see if I can get funding for a portable ramp, or maybe, I can see if I can exercise with a friend so we can navigate experiencing harassment. If we get shouted at, we can comfort it. We shouldn't have to experience it, but of course it does happen. How we kind of navigate that is more discernment of like, what isn't in my control, I can acknowledge that and see how I can navigate it and work around it. And what is in my control, what I can do something with. That it's a much more discerning perspective than cookie cutter solutions, which might seem positive and happy, but just don't work. And it's instead about creating something that's sustainable and flexible, and can live and grow with us, because that's what our roadmap can do.
Yeah, and I love that about this guide. Like a lot of resources I've come across, like when I was looking for myself, even when I was looking at just how to manage my illness, I come across websites where people say that they've, quote unquote cured their illnesses. And that's not never going to be achievable for me. But I very rarely come across resources that I feel, I guess, I could speak to me and what is possible for me. It's often things like if you eat healthy, you do yoga, and I just see a long list of things I can't do. And that's so overwhelming in itself that even if one thing on that list would have helped me, I don't even try because it's just too much. So having something that's accessible is essential.
Exactly. And that's, this is what I felt. That's what maybe I've worked with. We, many experience the same difficulties. And again, it does a disservice, I think, to often many of these tools, because, for example, yoga, often has been massively appropriated and divorced from its Southeast Asian culture and roots, and often, commodified and made into a kind of very white, aesthetic, aspirational practice, which of course it wasn't originally. But again, I actually have mobility and kind of so yoga isn't the best option for me, but yoga may be a good option for somebody. But if it is presented in this kind of hyper aspirational way, and within like this huge kind of massive list of shoulds in which you're supposed to, in your morning routine, you're supposed to do like the yoga and the meditation and the green juice and the lemon water and I don't know what the fashionable thing is now, because I'm not, don't see those kind of articles anymore, because I specifically don't look for them, or whatever it is. And so everything is a huge pressure. And then we get to what I call compulsive miracle cure culture, which is the idea that we should always be searching to recover and have a cure. And if we aren't seeking or even performing that search sufficiently, then, sarcasm, maybe we don't truly want to get well. And, we just a benefit scrounger. And, what if it's actually, or just, you just think you're ill? And do all this nonsense. And so we get blamed for becoming ill in the first place. And we get told that, if we'd done X differently, this wouldn't have happened. And of course, we have these multifactorial issues, and it's massively complex and never as simple as that. And so, as you say, there's this pressure to try and to push ourselves. And it takes us away from something that might connect us, might help us, might actually do something for us. And so that's the thing. It's often I've seen the narratives as either brave sufferer, not doing or trying anything, you just look brave and that's your job, or cured, or seeking a cure, get the cure. And I thought, well, I'm not any of those, because I want to see, and we talk about this a lot in the book, what is still possible. What is still possible? How do we make a life in the midst of it all, of whatever it all is for us at this time? How do we still make a life in the midst of it? Do you know, when I was first had my nano to be actually very severe relapse, but at the time it felt like I was just getting first chronically ill. Someone said, like, oh, you can do that when you're better. And I just sat there and thought, will I get better? And also, if I do, what will that look like? And how will I know when it comes? Because, like, you know, there aren't cures that don't exist for the conditions I have. I have some treatment plans for some of them, some management plans for some of them, but I'm still sick. I am not cured. And what if that's okay? What if I don't have to wait to live? What if I can figure out what is still possible? And so that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think that's so powerful, the idea that you don't need to wait to live, you're living now. And I often come across that narrative in regards to myself and my own experience of people saying, well, when things improve, well, if they find a cure, maybe you'll be able to live then. But it's like, well, I'm still living. You know, I may be disabled, but I am still alive and I'm still living in this body. And I think making space for that without an expectation that it has to get better to live, I think that's so powerful and something I try and embody every day. Maybe my life doesn't look ideally how I'd like it to look right now, health wise, but I am still alive. And I find that quite empowering myself.
Yeah. And this speaks to, you know, your beautiful podcast title, Alive with Chronic Illness.
Yes, thank you. And I suppose as we're coming to the end now, I'm interested to know whether if anyone listening is considering writing a book or maybe writing about their own experiences, is there anything that you would advise them to do?
Yes. So I love this question. So yes. So firstly, like, yes, please write it if you can. You know, go for it if you want to, if you feel pulled towards you. I mean, I guess I first start with saying nobody has to write something. So years ago, a friend of mine went through, you know, very difficult circumstances, very young, around illness, and everybody said to them, "Oh, you know, you'll write a beautiful book about this, and you know, you'll have to write about such a kind of astonishing experience. You'll have to write a book." And then one day they said to me, almost like whispering, like, "Grace," and this is a fictionalized example, "Grace, I don't think I want to write a book." I said, "You don't have to." And I said, "Don't I?" Said, "No, you don't have to write a book if you don't want to. It's just because you've experienced something extraordinary doesn't mean you have to write about it." And was it, I'm trying to remember who this was and I apologize. I can't remember if it was Stella Young, who's the fantastic Australian author who does a wonderful TEDx talk called Don't Call Me Inspirational. So I'd have to go and check this. My apologies if I'm misattributing this, but I remember the story where I think it was Stella. The speaker said she was teaching, and she's a disabled and a wheelchair user. And halfway through the class, one of the kids said to her, "Oh, Miss, when do you begin your speech?" And she said, "What do you mean my speech?" And he said, "Well, you know, when the wheelchair people come, they're normally in the big hall, like, but you know, when they give their inspirational speech, when are you going to begin your speech?" And the person was like, "I'm a maths teacher. I'm not giving an inspirational speech." But the kids had only ever met disabled people in terms of our being inspirational and talking about how to overcome hardships. And so if somebody wants to do that and feels compelled to do that, or write about the experience, they absolutely can, and I will speak to that. But I just want to start by saying we don't have to. We don't have to be inspirational. We don't have to write about our story. We don't have to write about our experiences. If you don't want to, there's no obligation to. It's okay. The information will land with people in some way. I trust and believe. You know, you'll kind of speak with your circle, etc., etc. So it's not the only thing that we can do. But of course, if you do have a story you want to share, if you do want to write, I'm 1,000% with you. Go for it. I can't wait to read it. And so, you know, we need more voices. We need our stories to be heard. Less than 1% of authors in the UK are from, this is from the work of a writing chance and Michael Sheen, who partnered with the Daily Mirror on this. I think it was less than 1% of journalists and authors are from a working class background. And I don't believe there actually are statistics about disabled and working class writers or people like myself with multiple marginalized identities, because there are so few of us. So, you know, if you are writing, get support. If it's possible to join a writing group, you can join us online, take a class if you can, read books about writing. So I can really recommend Nikesh Shukla's Your Story Matters. Just start with that, it's brilliant. my one of my mentor, Kathy Renson Brink's brilliant book, Write It All Down. That's just so good. Then if you're kind of more into like novel, they're both good for novels too, but for editing, I really recommend Alison K. Williams' Seven Drafts, and my colleague Sarah Selecki's upcoming story is A State of Mind. You know, you don't have to do it alone. These are brilliant books. Often they're based on classes or years of training that can take you through them. And if you want to publish, you know, check out Courtney Mann's before and after the book deal. And again, as I say, you don't have to write, but you also don't have to publish if you write. And if you want to publish, you have my absolute support. Brilliant, go for it. But it's just, again, I'm kind of trying to unhook from this very capitalist idea and this very kind of aspirational idea of it being, well, I'll experience, and actually quite often we're kind of really pressured by people, which is like, if I make something out of it, then the suffering was worth it. And it's often a kind of psychological attempt to jump over the stages of grief, to jump over sitting with the reality of the suffering. But of course, even if you write a book out of it, it doesn't necessarily make the suffering okay. It doesn't necessarily make anything worthwhile. In fact, it can lead to writing that reads as very unprocessed. It very much reads as somebody's desperately trying to make their trauma not have been a bad thing because they got this story out of it, which you can absolutely understand the impulse, but they often need some more support through that process. And so, you know, again, I tried to find the source of the story, but I think it was from Benjamin Zephaniah, but again, I can't find it written. It was told to me, was that the author said, you know, when I'm in the UK and I say I'm a writer, people say, oh, will I have read anything you've published? And they said, well, that's interesting, because they said when they were in their home country, people said, oh, you're a writer, you're a poet, give us a poem. Give us a poem. Like, yes, we'd recite, perform, we'd love that, share with us a poem. And so there's different attitudes towards performance and sharing of work. It's not just a bad thing happened to me, but I made something good out of it, so see, it's okay now, and I published it, and the publishing validates the fact that I did the work and the fact that I suffered. Like, I think it's all much more diffuse and complex than that. And so, you know, we can publish, but we don't have to. Writing and journaling are valid and can be very therapeutic in and of themselves. But yeah, Courtney Mann's book is a great book about the complexities and processes of navigating publishing, particularly of marginalized identities. Because I do believe that writing and journaling is always worthwhile, no matter what outcome we have with it. And I know it might seem like it's easy for me to say because I am now obviously published, but I just always really think that, you know, it's a very it's an automatic that we kind of often say, oh, well, if you've written, are you published? And that's just one way to celebrate. And like, I played harp, and my harp tutor was very into like the kind of give us a poem style working. He liked recitals. And so the one day somebody came to the door with a parcel, and he kindly, this is pre-COVID, he kindly brought it inside for me because I couldn't obviously lift it. It's very heavy. And then he saw my harp, and the guy said, oh, who does the tellin belong to? And tellin is Welsh for harp. And I said, oh, that's me. That's my harp. I play. And he's like, oh, lovely, because he couldn't remember the English word for harp, which is understandable. And my Welsh teacher my harp teacher was also Welsh speaking, and he would also tutor me in Welsh. And so I thought he'd like this story, so I told him this story. And he looked at me and said, and did you offer him a recital? I said, no, I didn't offer the delivery guy a recital. And he said, why not? He said, he's Welsh speaking, he likes the harp, you know, he's an appreciator of the telling. What more are you looking for, Grace? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, how lovely that instead of it being an expectation of like, oh, you play the harp, what grade are you? Have you performed anywhere? How good, you know, this kind of very external validation was, did you share the music with somebody who's obviously an appreciator of it? And so I kind of carry that. I'm not going to be offering off-the-cuff recitals to delivery people, probably. But I like the idea that it's a different way of thinking about how we share our creativity outside of kind of the more formalized structures which we often recognize.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, just being mindful that you don't need to put your story out there, and you can own what you do share about yourself. And that's something that I feel very aware of, and I'm very I'm quite open actually as a person. However, there's a lot of things about my life that I just choose not to share. And I think sometimes just writing a book can be for yourself. It can be writing your own experience, and just it's something that you can choose to publish if you want to, or you can share it with friends or just with yourself, just because you know it exists.
Exactly. And this is something my teacher Kathy Ransom-Brink is kind of very strong on, that writing it is in itself something that is incredibly valuable and powerful. And exactly, and there's lots of ways to get a book out there. As you say, you can share it with friends and family. You could kind of publish a small amount. You could, hey, I don't know, you could put it on a Substack. You could make it into 2,000 TikTok videos. You could run a wonderful podcast such as yourself, and you could touch on a different kind of section of the book with a guest every week. There's 1,000 ways to get our work and our words out there. This is just one way, but the engaging with it and the creativity of it and the process of that, I think, is the most important.
Amazing. Yes, thank you. So it sounds like your biggest tips, if someone was listening who maybe was thinking about writing, was to be mindful of that creative process and what that means in itself, and not worry too much about a perceived end goal like publishing. Just be in the process.
Yes, especially when you're first writing, and to get support in it, to not try and do it alone. So, kind of get some writing, get support, find if you can other writers online, and see if you can get kind of support and community through it. Because the other part of writing, I think, is being what I've heard called a good literary citizen. So that is, reviewing other people's books, supporting libraries, supporting literary magazines. I was a volunteer for a literary magazine for a period where we would kind of read submissions and help to kind of score and kind of vote on what would be in the magazine. And, quite often you got submissions and you thought, I'm not sure you've ever read the magazine. Which obviously isn't particularly helpful in terms of tailoring your pitch to it. But also I kind of think, well, it's not just about us putting our work out there, it's about our work being conversation and being part of a wider conversation and a wider community. So it's not like, I say in the book, this is a tiny contribution to a much wider conversation, which I hope will, obviously continue and go onwards. And so it's also part of, how you're part, again, we're back to community, it's how you're part of that community as well. Because otherwise sometimes we can get very kind of fixed or hooked into because of course publishing is so inequitable and is still gatekept and is still very kind of limited in the amount of slots that are available for books per year. That there's a reason there's a level of scarcity there, but that can mean we get very rigid around kind of getting our work heard. And sometimes a kind of way to navigate that in ourselves is to actually go and signal boost some other authors and share and support their work, and to really kind of, and then remember actually this is part of a wider conversation. I always remember one of my colleagues, the one time I was working with her and I had a class I was teaching, which the book is now based on. I just remember she went, oh, she said, thank goodness you've done it. She said, I'd been meaning to do that course for years and I never got round to it. And she said, thank God you've done it. So now I can just refer people to you. I was like, wonderful. And of course, she had done a course on morning routines, and I was referring people to her all the time because I was like, and so it was just that ease of going, oh, I don't have to do it on my own. You've done it. Great. I can just send people your way and I can do something else.
Yeah, and I think that feeds into community again and the power of community, and finding, like you said there, other being part of the literature community. There's often a lot of isolation I've found that comes alongside being disabled. So if you can find communities where people share your passions and you can really engage with and feel heard, I think that's so important and so powerful. And it's been a big part of my journey to self-acceptance. But somehow, like being surrounded by people who accept me as I am helps me kind of see myself through their eyes. And it made me feel very different from sitting in a room with people who didn't perhaps understand my experiences as a disabled person. Being then in a room where I knew I could speak freely and be heard.
Yeah, there's so much isolation and loneliness, and we often and ableism that contributes to that, and we often don't see our experience represented in the media, in traditional publishing, and so that contributes to a feeling of isolation. So absolutely, find a disability community is hugely important. And interestingly, a lot of writers do have chronic illness because it's something that we can do in a relatively kind of sitting down or lying down position with pacing. So it can sometimes be a place to find disability community as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been lovely speaking to you.
Thank you. It's been a delight. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for holding and creating and curating this space. And thank you to everybody listening or reading the transcript. I'm deeply glad. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being you.
Thank you.